A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine a 15-meter-long steel tube emerging from a dark mountain tunnel, driving across jagged desert terrain, and erecting a multi-ton ballistic missile in under 30 minutes. That is the reality of the Transporter Erector Launcher, or the TEL, and it is the absolute linchpin of Iran's strategic posture. Today's prompt from Daniel is about these machines, the mobile interface between those famous underground missile cities and the surface world.
It is a great topic because people tend to focus on the missile itself, the range, the warhead, the guidance, but the TEL is the legs of the entire operation. Without it, those missiles are just very expensive lawn ornaments sitting in a cave. By the way, today's episode is powered by Google Gemini 3 Flash. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have been digging into some of the latest satellite imagery from March 2026, specifically looking at the Khoramabad facility. We are seeing expanded TEL garages there, which suggests a major push toward even greater mobility and readiness than we saw just a year or two ago.
So, before we get into the weeds, let's define this for the folks at home. A TEL is essentially a heavy-duty truck that does three things. It transports the missile, it erects it into a vertical firing position, and then it acts as the actual launch platform. It is a 3-in-1 engineering marvel that solves the biggest problem any missile program has, which is, how do you keep your toys from getting blown up before you can use them?
That is the core of the shoot and scoot doctrine. If you have a fixed silo, your enemy knows exactly where it is. They can park a satellite over it and wait for the doors to open. But if your launcher is on wheels, you can hide it in a civilian warehouse, a mountain tunnel, or a forest. Drive it out to a random patch of asphalt fire and be 5 miles away before the counter battery fire arrives. In Iran's case, the TEL is the bridge. It connects the deep, hardened storage of the Zagros Mountains to the tactical flexibility of the open road.
I think there is a misconception that these are just modified garbage trucks or something. But when you look at the engineering, especially the axle configurations, you realize how specialized they are. We are talking 8x8 or 10x10 drive systems. Herman, how do these things actually handle the Iranian topography? Because we aren't talking about smooth interstate highways here.
The terrain is a massive factor. Iran is incredibly mountainous, but it also has these vast, high-altitude salt deserts. To move a missile like the Khorramshahr, which can weigh 20 tons or more, you need incredible load distribution. If you put that much weight on a standard semi-truck, you'd sink into the first soft shoulder you hit. That is why you see these massive Chinese-derived chassis, like the Wanshan Special Vehicle WS-2700. These use a multi-axle steering system where almost every wheel is powered and many of them can turn. This gives a 30-ton vehicle a turning radius that is surprisingly tight, allowing them to navigate those narrow, winding mountain passes that lead to the tunnel portals.
But wait, how does a 10-axle vehicle handle a hairpin turn in the Zagros Mountains? I've seen photos of those roads. They are barely wide enough for a donkey cart in some places.
That's where the all-wheel steering comes in. On a standard semi-truck, only the front wheels turn. On a high-end TEL, the rear axles often steer in the opposite direction of the front ones at low speeds. It essentially allows the back of the truck to follow, the front through a much tighter arc. It's like a giant lethal version of those fire trucks with the steering wheel at the back. Without that, these things would be restricted to major highways, which would make them incredibly easy to track and kill.
And the erector part of the name. That is not just a simple hydraulic lift, right? I imagine the stability requirements for a vertical launch from the back of a truck are insane. If the truck wobbles a fraction of a degree during ignition, that missile is going to the wrong country.
The stability is handled by massive hydraulic outriggers. Before the missile is even tilted up, these giant steel legs extend from the sides of the chassis and lift the entire truck slightly off its suspension. This creates a rock-solid, level platform. The erection mechanism itself is usually a heavy-duty hydraulic ram. In the newer Iranian systems, like the Fateh 100, they have gotten the time to launch down to under 30 minutes. That includes driving to the site, leveling the vehicle, erecting the missile, and completing the final guidance alignment.
30 minutes is remarkably fast. It gives an adversary a very narrow window to detect, identify, and strike. But let's talk about how these things interface with the missile cities. Daniel asked if these are the things carrying the missiles up from the depths. From what we know about the internal logistics of those tunnels, is the TEL doing the heavy lifting inside the mountain, or is there a handoff happening?
It is a mix of both, and this is where the engineering gets really interesting. For their older liquid-fueled missiles, like the Shahab series, the TELs are often just transport vehicles. The missiles are stored horizontally on racks, moved to the TEL, and then driven out. But for the newer missile magazine systems the IRGC showed off a few years ago, they've actually automated the process. They use a rail-based system deep underground. Imagine a vertical rail car that holds the missile upright. These cars move along a track like a giant automated warehouse. When it is time to fire, the rail car moves the missile to a specific launch portal, a hardened hatch in the side of a mountain, and fires it directly from the rail system.
So in that scenario, the city itself is the TEL. The mountain is the chassis.
In a way, yes. But the TELs still play the primary role for the solid fuel fleet, like the Sejil or the Khaibar Shekin. Solid fuel missiles are much more stable and can be kept ready to go for longer periods. You can keep a Sejil on the back of a TEL inside a tunnel, and the second the order comes in, that truck just drives to the portal and fires. You don't have to deal with the dangerous, slow process of pumping liquid oxygen or fuel into the missile while you're exposed on the surface.
But what about the exhaust? If you're firing a missile from a rail car inside a tunnel, or right at the mouth of a portal, where does all that superheated gas go? You can't just let it bounce around inside a confined space. It would melt the equipment and suffocate the crew.
That's a massive engineering hurdle. These missile cities have sophisticated venting systems, essentially giant chimneys carved through the rock that lead to the surface, often miles away from the actual launch portal. They use flame buckets and heat-resistant ceramics to channel the blast. If you fire from a TEL just outside the portal, the truck has to withstand the backblast. That's why you see those heavy steel blast shields over the driver's cabin on the newer models. It protects the electronics and the glass from the literal hellfire happening 5 feet behind the driver's head.
I was looking at some of the clearance specs for those mountain portals. These aren't just big garage doors. They have to be reinforced against overpressure from potential near misses by bunker busters. Does that limit the size of the TELs Iran can use? You can't exactly drive a massive intercontinental ballistic missile launcher through a standard tunnel.
It absolutely dictates the dimensions. Most of these tunnels are carved into granite or limestone, and the portals are often hidden behind blast doors that can weigh dozens of tons. The clearance is tight, sometimes only a few dozen centimeters on either side of the vehicle. This is why Iran has focused so heavily on compact TEL designs. They swap out the massive multi-section trailers for integrated chassis where the cab and the launcher are one single unit. It makes the vehicle shorter and more maneuverable inside the tunnel network.
You mentioned the Wanshan chassis from China earlier. How much of this is actually indigenous Iranian engineering versus just putting a local coat of paint on Chinese or North Korean hardware?
It is a significant evolution. While the early TELs were definitely imported, mostly from North Korea, who got the tech from the Soviets and the Chinese, Iran has moved toward a high degree of domestic modification. They take a base chassis like the WS-2700 and completely rebuild the electronics and the hydraulic systems. They've developed their own automated leveling systems and rapid alignment sensors. They also have a very clever civilian pattern program. They take a standard commercial Volvo or Scania tractor trailer, reinforce the frame, and hide a missile launcher inside a trailer that looks like it is hauling refrigerated chickens. The roof flips up, the missile erects, and suddenly a highway rest stop is a launch site.
That is the ultimate nightmare for intelligence analysts. If every semi-truck on the road is a potential ballistic missile platform, how do you even begin to track that? It reminds me of the Great Train Bumper idea from the Cold War with the Soviet Rail Mobile ICBMs. If it looks like a normal part of the background, it is invisible.
And that invisibility is a force multiplier. If you have 500 missiles but only 50 TELs, your effective launch capacity is limited by the trucks. But if you have hundreds of these civilian TELs, you can disperse your entire arsenal across the country. Recent intelligence assessments from 2025 suggest that Iran has been moving a lot of these operations further inland, toward places like Yazd in central Iran. They are moving away from the borders to increase the buffer zone against airstrikes, relying on the 2,000-kilometer range of the Segil to still hit their targets in Israel or the Gulf from deep within the interior.
Let's talk about the operational implications of that mobility. If I am a commander for a missile defense battery, say a Patriot or an Arrow 3 system in the region, how does the TEL's mobility change my math? I assume it makes the kill chain much more difficult to complete.
It complicates everything. In the world of missile defense, you have two types of kills. You have the left of launch kill, where you destroy the missile on the ground before it fires, and the right of launch kill, where you intercept it in the air. TELs are designed specifically to defeat left of launch strategies. If you can't find the launcher until the moment it fires, you've already lost the chance to take it out on the ground. Once the missile is in the air, you're dealing with things like the K-bar Shekin, which reportedly has a maneuverable re-entry vehicle. So, the TEL buys Iran the time and secrecy it needs to get that missile into the boost phase.
But how does the TEL crew actually know where they are? If they just drive to a random patch of desert, they need precise GPS coordinates to program the missile's flight path, right? If the truck is off by 10 meters, the missile misses its target by a mile.
That used to be the weak point. In the old days, they had to use pre-surveyed launch sites, specific spots on the map where the coordinates were already known. But now, they use INS, inertial navigation systems, coupled with satellite positioning. The TEL has a built-in north-seeking gyro compass. Even if GPS is jammed, the truck knows its exact position and orientation relative to the Earth's axis. They can pull over anywhere, and the onboard computer calculates the launch solution in seconds. It removes the need for those fixed launch pads that satellites could easily monitor.
And once it fires, the TEL isn't just sitting there waiting for a thank you note. It is scooting. How fast can they realistically pack up and disappear back into a tunnel?
For a modern Iranian crew, we are looking at maybe 10 to 15 minutes to retract the outriggers, lower the erector arm, and get the vehicle moving. If the launch site is within a few kilometers of a missile city portal, that truck can be back under 500 meters of granite before an F-35 can even get a lock on the heat signature from the launch. It creates this whack-a-mole scenario that is incredibly resource-intensive for an adversary to counter. You'd need constant 24/7 drone or satellite coverage over thousands of square miles of Iranian territory to have a hope of catching them in the act.
What about the second-order effects on regional security? If Iran can guarantee that 50% or more of its mobile fleet will survive an initial strike, that fundamentally changes the deterrence calculus, doesn't it? It means a preemptive strike by the US or Israel can never truly disarm them.
That is exactly the point. It is about assured second strike capability on a regional scale. If an adversary knows that no matter how hard they hit, Iran will still be able to launch 100 missiles an hour later from mobile platforms they couldn't find, it makes the cost of an initial attack much higher. This is why the satellite imagery from March 2026 is so significant. Seeing more garages at Khorramabad isn't just about storage, it is a signal. It tells the world that Iran is increasing the number of legs it has for its missiles. More TELs equals more simultaneous launches and more targets for an enemy to try and find.
It is also worth noting how this compares to something like the US Minuteman III system. We rely on these massive fixed silos in the Great Plains. They are hardened, sure, but everyone knows exactly where they are. Iran's approach is the polar opposite. They are trading the raw power and size of silo-based missiles for the stealth of mobility. It is a guerrilla warfare mindset applied to strategic ballistics.
It is very effective for a nation that doesn't have air superiority. If you can't control the skies, you have to control the ground and the underground. One thing I found wild in some of the recent technical papers is the development of automated driving for these TELs. There are reports that Iran is experimenting with autonomous navigation for these vehicles within the tunnel complexes. Imagine a fleet of these things moving like robots through a mountain, positioning themselves at portals without needing a human driver to navigate the tight clearances.
That is terrifying and fascinating at the same time. If you automate the TEL movement, you can coordinate a massive synchronized launch across dozens of sites with millisecond precision. It removes the human error of a driver getting stuck in a tunnel or missing a turn in the dark.
And it speeds up the magazine effect. If you can cycle TELs in and out of a portal like a conveyor belt, you turn a single tunnel exit into a rapid-fire battery. Instead of one launch every hour, you could potentially have one every few minutes. That would completely overwhelm any existing missile defense system, which are all designed to handle a finite number of incoming threats at once.
We should probably address the liquid fuel versus solid fuel thing a bit more, because it really dictates how the TEL is used. If I'm driving a TEL with an EMAD missile, which is liquid fueled, I'm basically driving a giant unfueled pipe. I have to meet up with a fuel truck at some point, right? That seems like a huge vulnerability.
It is a massive vulnerability. Fueling a liquid-fueled ballistic missile is an ordeal. You're dealing with highly corrosive volatile chemicals. It takes hours. If you do that on the surface, you're a sitting duck. This is why Iran's missile cities are so crucial for the liquid-fueled fleet. They do the fueling deep underground in specialized ventilated chambers. The TEL then carries a fully fueled, ready-to-fire missile to the surface. It is still more dangerous than solid fuel, but it hides the most vulnerable part of the process.
How do they handle the boil-off, though? If they fuel it underground and then drive it to a launch site, doesn't the fuel start to degrade or evaporate?
Liquid-fueled missiles are generally fire or drain weapons. Once you fuel them, you have a very narrow window before the chemicals start eating through the gaskets or the cryogenic components warm up. That's why the TEL has to be fast. It's a race against the chemistry of the fuel itself. Solid fuel, on the other hand, is like a battery. It just sits there holding its charge until you need it.
Whereas with the solid fuel Sagil, the fuel is basically a hard rubber-like substance already packed into the casing. It can sit on the back of a TEL for months in a warehouse, and the second you turn the key, it is ready to go. No fuel trucks, no chemical spills, no heat signature from the fueling process.
That is why the shift we've seen in the last few years towards solid fuel motors is so strategically important. It makes the TELs much more independent. They don't need a convoy of support vehicles. A single Sagil TEL can operate solo, hiding in a remote canyon for weeks if necessary. That kind of lone wolf capability is what makes the mobile program so resilient.
Let's pivot to the takeaways for the folks listening. What does all this engineering detail actually mean for the average person trying to make sense of the news? To me, the first big takeaway is that mobility is a force multiplier. You don't need the most advanced missile in the world if you have the most survivable launch system.
I would agree with that. The TEL is what makes the Iranian missile threat real in a tactical sense. It is the difference between a theoretical capability and an actual usable weapon system. The second takeaway is that monitoring these things is the early warning system of the future. If you want to know if tensions are escalating, you don't look at the missiles, you look at the TELs. If they start moving out of their permanent garages and into the civilian warehouses or deeper into the mountains, that is a clear signal of intent.
And for the open source intelligence nerds out there are actually ways to follow this. People should look at accounts like at Nuclear Iran on X. They do incredible work analyzing satellite imagery and tracking these dispersal patterns. When you see those expanded garages at Khoramabad that Herman mentioned, that isn't just construction news, it is a shift in regional power dynamics.
It really is. And the third takeaway is to look for the second-order effects. As TELs get more mobile and easier to hide, it forces their neighbors and the US to invest more in persistent surveillance. We are talking about constellations of thousands of small satellites and long-endurance drones. The arms race isn't just about the missiles themselves, it is an arms race between hiding and finding. The TEL is the champion of the hiding side of that equation.
It is a fascinating game of cat and mouse. Only the mouse is a 30-ton truck carrying a nuclear-capable ballistic missile, and the cat is a billion-dollar satellite 300 miles up in space. I think it is easy to get bogged down in the politics, but when you look at the raw engineering, the axle loads, the hydraulic pressures, the tunnel clearances, you see the real backbone of their strategy.
It is pure physics and logistics. One question I'm left with as we look toward the next decade is how autonomous driving and AI will change this. If you can have a ghost fleet of TELs that doesn't require any humans on the ground, does that make them even harder to track? Humans leave footprints, they need food, they use radios. A fully autonomous TEL could sit silent and cold in a desert for a month and then suddenly come to life. That is a whole new level of shoot and scoot.
Do you think they're actually capable of that kind of AI integration? I mean, building a truck is one thing, but building a self-driving truck that can navigate a war zone is another level.
They don't need Tesla-level full self-driving. They just need path following. If you map a desert road with high-resolution LiDAR once, the truck just has to follow those digital breadcrumbs. Iran has already shown very advanced drone capabilities. Those Shahid drones are basically flying AI robots. Applying that logic to a heavy truck chassis isn't a huge leap. It's more about the communications link being hardened against jamming.
It would certainly blur the lines between defensive and offensive postures. If your entire fleet is invisible and autonomous, your neighbor has to assume you're always ready to fire. It creates a hair-trigger environment that is pretty unsettling.
It does, but that is the world we're moving into. The TEL is only going to get faster, stealthier, and more integrated into that underground infrastructure. It really is the ultimate interface between the hidden world of the missile cities and the very public world of regional conflict.
I also wonder about the maintenance of these things. If you have 100 TELs hidden in mountain tunnels, how do you keep the engines running and the hydraulics from seizing up? You can't exactly take a missile launcher to a local mechanic.
That's why these missile cities are more than just tunnels. They are underground cities. They have full machine shops, spare parts depots, and even living quarters for the technicians. They treat these trucks like submarines. They go on patrol inside the mountain, get serviced in a dry dock-like bay, and then rotate back to a standby position. It's a very high-maintenance way to run a military, but if you're worried about survival, it's the only way.
Well, I think we have thoroughly explored the legs of the program today. If there is one thing I've learned, it is that I will never look at a refrigerated chicken truck the same way again while driving on the highway.
Just keep an eye out for any hydraulic outriggers, corn. If you see those, maybe take the next exit.
Good advice. This has been a deep dive into the engineering of the TEL. Thanks to everyone for listening to My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these deep dives useful, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us reach more people who want to understand the how behind the headlines.
Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. It makes all this research and technical analysis possible.
And thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for the full archive and all the ways to subscribe.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you in the next one.
Stay curious. Bye. This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.